In the crypts of ancient cathedrals across Poland, scientists discovered skeletal remains of kings and princes buried centuries ago. When they extracted the DNA from bones over 800 years old, what they found was so unexpected that it forced historians to completely reconsider who really ruled medieval Europe and where they actually came from. For more than 1,000 years, the story of how Poland was founded has been told in a particular way. Textbooks describe indigenous Slavic nobility rising to power through strength and wisdom, establishing a kingdom that would eventually stretch across vast territories of Eastern Europe. This narrative has been taught in schools, preserved in historical texts, and woven into the very fabric of Polish national identity. But in April of 2026, scientists published research that would fundamentally challenge everything we thought we knew about Poland's origins and reshape our understanding of medieval European history itself. The research appeared in Nature Communications, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The study was titled Genetic Genealogy of the Piast Dynasty and Related European Royal Families, and it represented 5 years of meticulous investigation involving archaeologists, geneticists, historians, and anthropologists working together to answer a question that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Who were the Piasts, really? Where did they come from? How did they establish control over the Polish lands? And perhaps most importantly, what does their genetic evidence tell us about the founding of medieval European civilization? The Piast dynasty stands as one of the most important royal families in European history. They ruled Poland for over 4 centuries, beginning in the 10th century. Prince Mieszko Thrombmeier is remembered as the first documented ruler of this dynasty. Under his leadership and that of his successors, what had been a small, emerging political entity transformed into a major power. By the height of the 14th century, the Polish kingdom stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north all the way to the Black Sea in the south. The Piasts shaped the religious, cultural, and political development of an entire region. They converted Poland to Christianity, positioning the kingdom within Western European Christendom rather than the Orthodox Christianity of Russia or the remaining paganism of other regions. They established political institutions that would outlast their dynasty and form the foundation of Polish statehood. Yet despite their enormous historical significance, the true origins of the Piast family had remained shrouded in mystery. Historians had proposed various theories about where the Piasts came from. Some scholars suggested they were of Norman origin, descended from Scandinavian Vikings who had migrated southward and eastward across Europe. Others theorized that they were refugees from the Principality of Nitra in present-day Slovakia, having fled when that region was conquered by the expanding Great Moravian Empire in the 9th century. Still others insisted they were simply local. Slavic nobility who rose to power through their position and influence within the Polish lands. Each theory had its proponents and its critics. Each could point to historical documents and archaeological evidence that seemed to support its claims, yet none could be definitively proven. This is where modern genetic science entered the picture, offering a tool that transcended the limitations of traditional historical research. DNA carries within it the complete history of human ancestry. Every person alive today possesses genetic material that connects them directly to their forebears, stretching back thousands of years. This genetic material contains markers that can reveal which populations an individual's ancestors belong to, which regions they came from, and how they are related to other populations across the globe. Modern scientists have learned to extract this genetic information even from remains that are centuries or even millennia old. They can read the ancient DNA preserved within bone tissue, can identify specific individuals from archaeological sites, and can trace family relationships across generations separated by hundreds of years. It is a scientific revolution that is transforming how we understand human history. They reviewed previous archaeological investigations, they examined documents and chronicles, they consulted with experts on Polish medieval history. They wanted to identify graves where human remains were likely to have been preserved, and where the historical evidence suggested Piast family members were actually buried. Most of the identified locations turned out to be merely symbolic graves, places where commemorative monuments had been erected, but where no actual human remains had ever been interred. This was disappointing, but not surprising. Medieval burial practices were not always what modern people might expect. Graves were sometimes moved, remains were sometimes relocated to different burial sites, monuments were sometimes erected at locations that did not actually contain the person they commemorated. But within 8 specific locations, the researchers found something truly remarkable. They discovered actual human bones that had been carefully preserved within graves, that historical records and previous archaeological analysis indicated had belonged to members of the Piast dynasty. The largest concentration of Piast remains was located in Płock Cathedral, one of the most significant royal burial sites in all of medieval Poland. This cathedral had served as a necropolis for the Piast dynasty across 4 centuries. According to historical sources, 18 members of the Piast family, 17 males and 1 female, had been buried within the cathedral. These remains represented 12 consecutive generations of the dynasty, spanning from the earliest period of Piast rule through the height of their power. Similarly, St. John the Baptist Cathedral in Warsaw contained the remains of 4 additional Piasts from the Masovian branch of the family, members of a cadet line who ruled the region of Masovia in the final centuries of the dynasty's existence. When researchers carefully examined these burial sites in 2019, they immediately recognized the challenges before them. Many of the graves had been disturbed over the centuries. This was not mysterious or unexpected. Centuries of history means centuries of changes, disturbances, and disruptions. Coffins had been damaged, bones had been moved, mixed, and compromised. Environmental factors had degraded some remains, while others had been preserved better than anyone might have expected. This was not ideal material for genetic analysis, but the researchers understood that ancient material, even compromised ancient material, could still yield valuable genetic information if handled properly and analyzed with sophisticated techniques. The team collected samples from 33 different graves, carefully extracting bone fragments and teeth for DNA analysis. These samples would become the foundation of the most comprehensive genetic study of a medieval European dynasty ever conducted. But the process of extracting usable DNA from ancient bone material is extraordinarily complex and requires specialized expertise. These were not fresh samples with intact genetic material. These were bones that had been in the ground for 800 years or more. The DNA within them had been degraded by time and exposure. It had accumulated damage patterns characteristic of ancient material. The genetic sequences had broken down into fragments, scattered through the bone tissue like pieces of a puzzle that had been shattered and scattered. The scientists worked in specialized laboratories dedicated exclusively to the analysis of ancient DNA. These facilities maintained strict protocols to prevent contamination from modern DNA, which could compromise results or lead to false conclusions. Workers wear protective clothing. Laboratories are maintained with positive air pressure to prevent outside contamination. Ultraviolet lights are used to damage any stray modern DNA that might be present. The facilities are physically separated from laboratories that work with contemporary DNA samples. Every precaution is taken to ensure that the ancient genetic material can be studied in isolation, uncontaminated by modern biological material. The extraction process itself is meticulous and time-consuming. Bone samples are cleaned carefully with sodium hypochlorite. They are then exposed to ultraviolet irradiation to further eliminate any modern contamination. The samples are drilled to extract bone powder from the interior, away from surfaces that might have been exposed to modern biological material. The bone powder is then treated with proteinus K and subjected to specialized extraction procedures using silica-based methods that isolate and purify the ancient DNA. The resulting genetic material is incredibly fragmented and damaged. But it is there. It can be sequenced, analyzed, and interpreted using sophisticated computational methods. Once the DNA was extracted and sequenced, the researchers began the process of genetic analysis. They were looking for specific information that could reveal the identity and origins of the individuals represented by these skeletal remains. They examined mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited exclusively through the maternal line and thus traces maternal ancestry across generations. They examined Y chromosome DNA, which is passed from father to son and traces paternal ancestry. They looked for specific genetic markers and haplogroups that could place individuals within broader populations and ancestral groups. They conducted kinship analysis, comparing the genetic profiles of different individuals to determine who was related to whom and in what manner. The breakthrough came when the researchers focused on the Y chromosome data. The Y chromosome represents a remarkable feature of human genetics. It is inherited directly from father to son, passing through the male line largely unchanged across generations, with occasional new mutations that mark the passage of time and the branching of lineages. This makes the Y chromosome an extraordinarily powerful tool for tracing paternal ancestry. It allows researchers to follow the male line of a family back through history, to identify which populations shared common male ancestors, and to determine whether individuals belong to the same paternal lineage. When the researchers examined the Y chromosome haplogroups of the Piast males they had identified through genetic analysis, they found something unexpected. It was a pattern that would prove to be the key to understanding Piast origins. 7 out of 10 individuals they had confirmed as Piasts carried the identical rare Y chromosome lineage designated as R1b B3549. This was not a common haplogroup in Central or Eastern Europe. In fact, it was extraordinarily rare in the regions where Poland is located. In modern European populations, this particular genetic lineage is barely present at all in Poland or the surrounding territories. Its absence from the region made its presence in the Piast dynasty all the more significant and revealing. The scientists then expanded their search. They accessed ancient DNA databases containing genetic information from archaeological samples recovered from sites across Europe. They looked for this same R1b BY3549 lineage in samples from different time periods and different regions. What they discovered was striking and revealing. This rare Y chromosome lineage appeared in 3 ancient individuals whose samples were preserved in these databases. One individual was from present-day France, dated to Ur, approximately 770 to 540 BCE. Another individual was from the Netherlands, dated to approximately 20 to 200 CE. The third individual was from England, dated to approximately 940 CE. And archaeological evidence indicated this person was almost certainly of Viking origin. This pattern of distribution was not random. It told a story that transcended centuries. If the Piasts, the founding dynasty of Poland, carried a Y chromosome lineage that was extremely rare in Poland and the surrounding region, but was found in ancient samples from France, the Netherlands, and England, the implications were clear and profound. The Piasts had not originated in Poland. They were not indigenous to the region they ruled. They were outsiders. They were migrants who had come from somewhere else, who had brought their genetic lineage with them, and who had established themselves as rulers over the existing Slavic populations, who already inhabited the Polish lands. This discovery raised fundamental questions about medieval European history. For centuries, historians had assumed that medieval kingdoms were typically founded and ruled by indigenous nobility who emerged from the local populations they governed. But the genetic evidence suggested a different pattern. It suggested that at least some of the most important medieval dynasties, including the Piasts, were actually founded by outsiders. This was not necessarily a negative judgment or an indication of foreign conquest in the traditional sense. Rather, it suggested that medieval state formation often involved outside groups positioning themselves as ruling elites over local populations, gradually integrating with the local population over generations, while maintaining their political control and power. But understanding the full scope and significance of this discovery requires understanding what else the genetic evidence revealed. The researchers conducted what is known as kinship analysis. By comparing the genetic profiles of different individuals found in the burial sites, they could determine who was related to whom. They could identify parent-child relationships with high confidence. They could identify sibling relationships. They could detect more distant family connections. This was crucial because it allowed the researchers to verify that the remains they had identified actually belonged to members of a single family lineage, and moreover, that the family structure they identified matched the genealogies documented in historical records. What they found was remarkable and unexpected. The genetic relationships between the identified individuals aligned with the historical genealogies with uncanny precision. When medieval chronicles indicated that individual A was the son of individual B, the DNA evidence confirmed that relationship. When historical records showed that 2 individuals were brothers, the genetic analysis supported that conclusion. When records indicated that an individual was the daughter of a particular royal couple, the DNA evidence verified that relationship. In one particularly interesting case, the researchers identified evidence of an illegitimate birth. An individual who historical records suggested was the son of a particular ruler did not share that ruler's Y chromosome lineage. Instead, the genetic evidence indicated that the biological father was someone else. Yet even this finding had parallels in historical records and contemporary accounts of illegitimacy within the royal family. But the most extraordinary confirmation of the researchers' work came from an entirely different source. The scientists had access to previously published genetic data from King Bela III of Hungary, who lived in the 12th century and belonged to the Árpád dynasty that ruled Hungary. Historical records documented extensive marriage alliances and family connections between the Piast and Árpád dynasties. These 2 powerful medieval families were connected through multiple marriages across several generations. The historical documentation was clear about these family connections, but could genetic evidence independently verify them? When the researchers compared mitochondrial DNA data from the Piasts they had identified with mitochondrial DNA data from King Bela III of Hungary, they found something extraordinary. An individual they had identified as Conrad I, a Piast ruler from the 12th century, carried the identical mitochondrial DNA haplogroup as King Bela III of Hungary. But the match went far deeper than this. The genetic analysis showed that not only did they share the same mitochondrial haplogroup, but they shared all in the specific mutations that define that haplogroup. They even shared an additional private mutation that appeared in neither the existing genetic databases nor in other samples from different populations. This level of genetic similarity could not possibly occur by coincidence. It could only indicate that these 2 individuals shared the same maternal ancestor, exactly as the historical records indicated they should, based on their documented family relationships. This cross-validation was extraordinarily important. It meant that the researchers were not simply guessing about which skeletal remains belonged to which historical figures based on incomplete evidence. They had objective genetic evidence that could be independently cross-checked against completely separate historical and genetic data from another royal family. The historical records matched the genetic evidence. That genetic evidence could be independently verified through connections to other dynasties with previously published genetic information. This created a web of corroborating data that was essentially impossible to dispute or challenge with alternative explanations. By the conclusion of their comprehensive analysis, the researchers had confidently identified at least 10 specific Piast individuals whose remains were among those excavated from the burial sites. They had traced genetic lineages through 13 consecutive generations of the dynasty. They had confirmed the accuracy and reliability of medieval historical records through independent genetic evidence. And they had established, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the founding family of Poland was not indigenous to the region where they established their rule and power. The historical implications of this discovery are truly profound and far-reaching. For centuries, scholars had speculated about Piast origins. Some argued they came from the Norman regions, suggesting they might have been Viking-descended rulers who migrated eastward from Scandinavia. Others proposed they were refugees from the Principality of Nitra in what is now Slovakia, having fled conquest by the expanding Great Moravian Empire. Still, others maintained that they were simply local Slavic elites who accumulated power and established themselves as rulers through their influence and position within the Polish lands. All of these theories had their supporters among the scholarly community and their critics, who disputed their validity. But none could be definitively proven through traditional historical methods. The DNA evidence now provided absolute clarity that transcended speculation. The Piasts carried genetic markers that connected them to northwestern Europe. They were carriers of Y chromosome lineages that were found in ancient samples from France, the Netherlands, and England. They were outsiders who migrated into the Polish lands and established dominance over the local Slavic populations. This is not necessarily meant as a negative judgment or a diminishment of Piast accomplishments. Many of the most successful state-building projects in human history have involved outside populations who brought different organizational structures, different technologies, or different political systems to regions, and combined them with local resources and local populations to create something new and powerful and enduring. In fact, the same pattern appears to have occurred in other parts of medieval Eastern Europe during the same historical period. The Rurikid dynasty, which founded the Russian state, may have similarly been of non-Slavic origin, possibly descended from Scandinavian traders and warriors who established control over the river routes and trade networks of Eastern Europe. The Árpád dynasty, which ruled Hungary, had similarly complex and foreign origins. It appears that the 9th to 11th centuries saw a pattern of foreign groups moving into East Central Europe and establishing themselves as ruling elites. These were not necessarily violent military conquests in the traditional sense, but rather a kind of gradual consolidation of power by outside groups who positioned themselves as the leadership class and governing authority over existing populations. This raises intriguing and important questions about the mechanisms of state formation in the medieval period. How did foreign groups establish and maintain control over local populations without overwhelming military conquest? What advantages did they possess that allowed them to position themselves as rulers? How did they navigate the cultural differences, the linguistic barriers, and the social structures of the populations they governed? How did they gain legitimacy in the eyes of the people they ruled? One clue comes from the historical record of Piast interactions with the broader European world. Mieszko Thormeier, the first documented Piast ruler, had close and carefully cultivated relations with the Holy Roman emperors. He supported various candidates for the imperial throne. He participated in the political machinations of the highest levels of European power. His son, Bolesław Krobry, competed directly with the Holy Roman Emperor for control of contested territories in Central Europe. His daughter, Sigrid the haughty, married powerful Scandinavian rulers, controlling territories that stretched from Sweden to the far north to England in the west. These were not the activities of isolated local nobles. These were the actions of sophisticated political operators who understood the complex dynamics of pan-European power, who cultivated alliances with the most powerful forces operating on the European continent, and who positioned their family as major players in the highest echelons of medieval politics. The genetic evidence suggests that the Piasts came from that same northwestern European world. They originated from the regions where they conducted their political business, where their relatives and their connections existed, where their cultural and linguistic roots ran deepest. Their foreign origins in northwestern Europe explained their extensive connections to that region and their sophisticated engagement in European-wide political networks. They were not provincial rulers suddenly thrust onto the European stage. They were members of the northwestern European elite who migrated eastward and established themselves as rulers in new territories. The Piasts were Christian rulers, and this religious identity was absolutely central to their success and their legitimacy. Mieszko and Fire converted Poland to Christianity in 966, aligning the emerging kingdom with Latin Christian civilization rather than the Orthodox Christianity that dominated Russia, or the paganism that still persisted among various Eastern European populations. This religious choice was not peripheral or secondary to Piast success. It was absolutely central to it. By adopting Christianity and aligning Poland with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the Piasts positioned themselves as part of Western Christian civilization. They transformed Poland in a remarkably short period from a pagan principality into a recognized European kingdom. This religious transformation granted them legitimacy in the eyes of Western European powers. It connected them to a broader religious and cultural identity that transcended regional boundaries. It is important to emphasize that the genetic evidence regarding Piast origins does not tell us about physical appearance. DNA, ancestry, and visible physical characteristics are related but not identical concepts. The genetic evidence does not indicate whether the Piasts looked different from the local Slavic population or whether they could have blended in physically with local populations over generations. DNA provides information about ancestry, lineage, and the populations from which ancestors came. It does not necessarily determine physical appearance in any straightforward way. What the DNA does tell us clearly is about origins, about paternal lineage, about which populations shared common male ancestors, and about the deep structure of family relationships extending back through history. The research also revealed something important and often overlooked about women's roles in medieval European politics and history. The study examined mitochondrial DNA from over 200 historical figures from 10 different European royal dynasties. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line, passing from mother to all her children, but not passed on by her sons to their children. This allowed the researchers to trace maternal lineages across these different families and dynasties. What emerged was a picture of women as crucial connectors between dynasties, as bearers of genetic and cultural information, as instruments of political alliance through marriage. Many Piast daughters married into other European dynasties, spreading Piast blood and Piast genetic material throughout the royal houses of Europe. Many women from other European families married into the Piast family, bringing with them their own genetic lineages and their own dynastic connections. These marriages were not just political gestures or arrangements of convenience. They created real genetic connections between families. They created family relationships and obligations that structured medieval European politics. They created networks of kinship that bound together the royal houses of medieval Europe. The study of mitochondrial DNA reveals the crucial role that women played in these networks, even though traditional historical narratives often downplayed or ignored that role. The implications of this research extend far beyond Poland or medieval history alone. The research demonstrates the revolutionary power of ancient DNA analysis to answer historical questions that traditional historical scholarship alone could never resolve. It shows how genetic evidence can either confirm or contradict historical narratives that have been accepted for centuries. It illustrates the importance of truly interdisciplinary approaches to history, where archaeologists, geneticists, historians, anthropologists, and other specialists work together to reconstruct the past. The study also raises important questions about identity and national origin stories. Many nations around the world have founding myths and narratives about who their ancestors were and where they came from. Some of these narratives are grounded firmly in historical fact. Others have been embellished, misremembered, distorted, or deliberately altered over centuries. Genetic evidence provides a powerful tool to test these narratives against objective biological reality. In the case of Poland and the Piast dynasty, the traditional narrative of indigenous Slavic origins has been directly challenged by DNA evidence suggesting foreign origins from northwestern Europe. This discovery does not negate Polish identity or Polish cultural heritage. The Piasts ruled Poland for over 4 centuries. They shaped Polish religious life and political structure in profound ways. They married into Polish families, and their descendants became thoroughly integrated into Polish society. They adopted Polish cultural practices and positioned themselves within Polish networks of power and influence. But genetic evidence has complicated the narrative of absolute indigeneity and suggests that even national founding stories do not always align neatly with genetic reality. This is not a negative finding. It is simply a more complete and accurate understanding of how medieval European civilization actually developed. The research was published in Nature Communications in April of 2026 under the title Genetic Genealogy of the Piast Dynasty and Related European Royal Families. The lead researchers were Michał Zenczak, Louisa Hanshu, and Marek Figlerowicz from the Institute of Bioorganic Chemistry at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Poznań. They worked in collaboration with colleagues from multiple Polish institutions, and with international partners specializing in ancient DNA analysis. The raw sequencing data was carefully deposited in the European Nucleotide Archive under project number Piasts 78346, making it publicly available for future research, verification, and analysis by the global scientific community. The methodology employed in the study was rigorous, sophisticated, and designed to ensure maximum accuracy and reliability. The researchers employed multiple complementary approaches to verify their findings. They used radiocarbon dating to confirm that skeletal remains dated to the appropriate historical periods and matched the expected lifespans of historical individuals. They conducted anthropological analysis to estimate the ages and physical characteristics of the individuals at the time of their death, and compared these estimates to historical records documenting the ages at death of various Piast rulers. They conducted genetic analysis using multiple independent software tools and computational methods to verify results. They examined kinship relationships and confirmed them using two different methodological approaches. When mitochondrial DNA evidence suggested a family connection between individuals, they verified it through independent connections to other royal families with previously published genetic data. This multi-layered approach to verification meant that false conclusions were unlikely. The various independent methods and data sources would all need to be incorrect to reach wrong conclusions. The fact that radiocarbon dating matched historical records, that anthropological age estimates matched documented ages, that kinship analysis confirmed expected family relationships, and that mitochondrial DNA connected identified Piasts to other verified royal families meant that the conclusions rested on a foundation of multiple independent confirmations. What emerges from this comprehensive research is not a simple story, but a complex and nuanced picture of medieval European dynastic history. The Piasts were foreign in origin, carrying genetic lineages that traced back to northwestern Europe, rather than to the local Slavic populations of Poland. But they became thoroughly Polish through centuries of rule, through cultural integration, and through extensive marriage alliances with local nobility and with members of other European royal houses. Over generations, the distinction between foreign rulers and native populations blurred and eventually disappeared entirely. The Piasts became as Polish as anyone else, even though their genetic origins lay elsewhere. This pattern repeats throughout human history. Conquering or incoming populations often establish themselves as ruling elites, but over generations, through intermarriage, cultural assimilation, adoption of local languages and customs, and the simple passage of time, they become indistinguishable from the local population in every meaningful sense, except for their genetic ancestry. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, were originally Scandinavian Vikings, but within a few generations, they were thoroughly anglicized and were considered English. The Angevin rulers of England and France were originally from Anjou, but they became English and French monarchs in every meaningful sense. The Habsburgs, though originating from the Alpine regions, eventually ruled vast multinational empires and became integrated into the regions they governed. This is how political power often worked in medieval Europe. Outside groups established themselves as ruling classes, then gradually became integrated into the regions and societies they ruled, while maintaining their political authority and status. The Piast story is one chapter in this larger narrative of medieval European political change and dynastic development, but it is a chapter that has been clarified, refined, and dramatically illuminated by modern genetic science. The DNA evidence has provided answers to questions that historians could speculate about and debate, but could never definitively resolve through traditional scholarship alone. It has confirmed that the traditional narrative of indigenous Slavic origins was incomplete at best and fundamentally misleading at worst. It has demonstrated with scientific certainty that one of medieval Europe's most important and influential royal dynasties actually originated from outside the region. It ruled and helped to build. This discovery also highlights the transformative role of genetic science in 21st century historical research and scholarship. In an era when scientists can extract usable DNA from bones over 800 years old, when they can identify specific individuals from ancient remains with high confidence, when they can trace family relationships across centuries and generations separated by hundreds of years, the field of history itself is undergoing transformation. Ancient DNA is rapidly becoming as important to historical research and scholarship as documents, artifacts, and traditional written sources. It provides a new type of evidence, objective and verifiable through independent scientific methods that can challenge, confirm, complicate, or completely overturn narratives constructed from traditional historical sources alone. The revolution in ancient DNA analysis is just beginning, and its full implications for how we understand human history are still unfolding. The Piast dynasty study represents one of the most significant applications of this new science to medieval history.